But it also is a good predictor of, will kids then want to adopt and imitate their parents? I want to be like you. Ooh, ooh. I want to be like you. I want to walk like you and talk like you. Oh, I should have worn my Cousin Louie tie, it occurs to me, but I didn't. Okay, so hi, I'm Justin Barrett. I'm president of Blueprint 1543. I'm a psychological scientist and former university professor. And this episode is my first follow-up to a previous topic that I talked about. Why are children born believers? Based on my book, Born Believers, The Science of Children's Religious Belief, published by Free Press back in 2012. Recently, I gave an interview for an article for Slate magazine. It appeared March 1st, I believe, 2025. The author was a Muslim writer who wanted to know what the implications are of the Born Believer thesis for him raising his children in his Muslim faith. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what are some of those implications for any religious faith. Quick reminder, if you haven't seen the previous video, please go watch it. But if you haven't, the short version of the Born Believers thesis is, by virtue of the nature of human beings, just the way that we are growing up in typical human environments, children have a natural receptivity to religious beliefs of various sorts. It's easy for them to acquire. They don't require lots of thorough indoctrination to acquire some basic religious beliefs. Why? Because our minds, quite naturally, are tuned to certain ways of thinking. Certain pathways of thinking are easier than others. For instance, we find it very natural and easy to wonder about the things in the natural world, why they are here, where they came from, and what their purpose is. Even for things that, from an adult perspective, we might think, well, that's kind of a funny thing to talk about purpose, like, why is that rock here? Or what's its purpose? We might not normally think about that sort of thing, but it appears that from early childhood, we actually have strong natural impetus to look around the world and see design and purpose. This is based largely on the work of Deborah Kellerman at Boston University and some of her colleagues, but other folks have corroborated her basic kinds of findings. So children come into the world wondering, what are these things for? What's their design? What's their purpose? And does that help account for why they're here? Second little bit of the recipe is that we also have a strong natural propensity to reason about purposes in terms of someone intended that purpose and brought it about. So who did it? Or it's a whodunit, like in those murder, or those crime movies, whodunit, it's a whodunit, that kind of thing. There's the whodunit kind of thinking, appears to be very natural about things like, why did that event happen? Or why is the river where it is? Why do tigers have stripes? All kinds of things like that. Obviously, and I do mean obviously, even for 3 and 4-year-olds, humans didn't make tigers, didn't make mountains, didn't make rivers. And so they're left with well, who's the one responsible for bringing about the natural design and purpose that I see? It can't be a human being. It needs to be someone who's even mightier than that. And we have further experimental evidence suggesting that it's actually pretty easy for children, even preschoolers, to reason about beings who are super powerful, super knowing, super perceiving. That is, they know things and they perceive things more than humans, have power beyond humans, and that they don't necessarily have to see either. Okay, then don't have to be physically, tangibly present for children to reason about them. Preschoolers don't find this all that difficult, it turns out. For these and numerous other reasons, many of the folks working in what is known as the cognitive science of religion, a field that I've been associated with, we have advanced various versions of the naturalness of religion thesis, it's sometimes called. That somehow, because of the way our minds naturally work, especially in human societies, we readily acquire religious beliefs. They are kind of the conceptual path of least resistance. My version of that is the Born Believers thesis. Okay, so that's the basic groundwork. So what and who cares? What does that mean for how you should introduce your children to a religious faith if you so desire? Well, one of the things it suggests right off the bat is you don't have to thoroughly indoctrinate or drill children. Okay, that's a myth that certain public intellectuals have tried to propagate, and it's just false. You don't have to work really hard to get children to form religious beliefs. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to be the type of person who they want to learn from. That's a good place to start. And if you are a parent, especially, it means you've got ideally a secure kind of relational attachment with your child and vice versa. They have a secure attachment with you. That is an attachment style that seems to characterize feelings of confidence. It's not nervous or anxious. It's, oh, I'm comfortable around you. I have a certain degree of just trust in you straight off the bat. Usually that comes from, it appears, very predictable parenting styles, a certain degree of warmth, a certain degree of predictability and structure in life, not too many environmental stressors sort of wreaking havoc on kids. Now, it's not entirely within the control of parents to bring this about, but we do have a lot of control over whether or not our children are going to have that kind of secure attachment with us. It follows sort of naturally into this idea of authoritative, not authoritarian, or permissive parenting styles. So you can think of parenting styles as running on a couple of different continua. One dimension being how controlling parents are. And if you get sort of too controlling, especially what looks like arbitrary rules and control and arbitrary punishments, that can push you towards what's called authoritarian parenting style. And it's associated with kids not having a lot of self-confidence or being able to make decisions for themselves and often being a little bit sort of scared as they grow up and navigating life, some anxieties and stuff there. Who can also be too permissive, and then they can sort of lack initiative, and you get all kinds of other kinds of negative social consequences.
Aren't they wonderful, darling?
How many are there?
36. Counted them myself.
36? But last year I had 37!
Yes, well, some of them are quite a bit bigger than last year.
I don't care how big they are!
No. This is what we're going to do. Is that when we go out, we're going to buy you 2 new presents. How's that, Pumpkin?
The sweet spot seems to be when parents exercise a degree of predictable control. They've got rules. They enforce the rules. The rules don't seem capricious or arbitrary. It's very predictable and secure. And so that's one dimension, is that sort of control. The other dimension is warmth. And there's a high degree of relational warmth, as children feel like they're loved, they're cared for by their parents or caregivers. Put those two together, you have this authoritative parenting style, which is associated with all kinds of good social goods, but it also is a good predictor of, will kids then want to adopt and imitate their parents? I want to be like you. Ooh, ooh.
Oh, ooby-doo. I want to be like you.
I want to walk like you and talk like you. That relational warmth has been associated, especially in dads. I should note, especially dads. Some sociological research has suggested one of the best predictors of whether a kid is going to adopt your religious beliefs, one of your children, is how warm is the father in the relationship, if the father is present. Not exactly sure why that is, but it seems to be the case.
Dad's home!
Kids need to feel like their dad loves them and has some emotional connection with them. Okay, so that's the big part of setting the stage for lots of good parenting, including teaching the religious faith. Second ingredient that, of course, is very important is, do you really have a religious faith as the teacher, as the parent? Not only do they want to be like you, do they want to learn from you, but does your faith sort of come through in just how you conduct yourself? Instead of telling your kids about praying, they need to see you pray. Instead of telling your kids about how to worship God, they need to see you worshiping God. Instead of saying God's really important to my life, they need to see that God is really important to your life in your actions, in the decisions that you make. And making some of that decision making transparent to them can be really helpful. It's almost like any other kinds of relationship or broader belief system. They need to see it in action. Kids learn by demonstration much more than they learn from teaching the rules, teaching the principles, the beliefs, and so forth. So they need to see it in action in you. If you want your kids to grow up in your faith, you ought to have one that's really genuine and infuses your entire life. The third observation is, it's weird to talk about religious beliefs differently from regular life. Like, oh, I believe in God. I don't say I believe in oxygen. I don't say I believe in gravity. We just talk about gravity and we talk about oxygen. Maybe we should just talk about God, what we think about God and how we feel about God and what we think God feels about us and how that matters to our lives again. Okay, so it needs to be organic. those are some of the things you do. We're not talking about reading books. I mean, you can read books to your kids about God and things like that, but more important, they need to see how it cashes out in your day-to-day life. So those are some of the really big pieces that I would recommend. And then what the Born Believers kind of thesis suggests is that you don't have to dumb things down too much. You don't have to do things like say, I'm going to teach my kids nothing but nice moral stories from the Bible for, until they're about 5 or 6 years old or 8 years old. You don't have to do that. I think a lot of Sunday school curriculum take that tack, at least when I've looked through those materials, that's what I find, is there seems to be an assumption that kids can't understand all, powerful creator gods who are super knowing and super perceiving and immortal and things like that. They just can't understand that stuff till they're older. False. They can understand that stuff. In fact, we have some reason to think that it might be harder for adults than kids to think about those things, those attributes of God, those sort of super attributes. So don't feel like you have to back off of those things because it'll somehow blow the kids' minds. Hit them with the facts. Again, in a meaningful, contextual kind of way. So they look around the world. Why are things the way they are? Well, God had a creative plan to bring them about this way. You don't have to get into the particulars of how God did that, just that God intended it and God brought it about. Or why do we make certain kinds of moral decisions that we do? Because we want to please God, or because they're the kinds of things that God thinks are good for us to do. And they will bring about goods in our lives because God loves us. And so God has given us things, certain kinds of behaviors and values and character strengths and virtues that we ought to try to live into because they're good for us and they're good for each other. Because God has our best in mind. They're those types of teachings that worked into day-to-day life are going to be very effective. You don't have to back off of the theological kinds of ideas. You can actually give them quite a bit more than I think we often realize. At risk of going too long, I'm going to leave it there. I do encourage you to read the book. I take up some of these issues in the book in more detail, and the literature keeps changing too, in that we keep learning more about how to raise kids, given what we now know about how their minds are naturally attracted to certain kinds of religious beliefs. Thanks for joining me, and please, as always, leave comments, make suggestions. I do try to answer substantive comments that I think I might have something useful to say to. Like, subscribe, share. But until next time, keep raising those born believers. See you next time. Thanks.